today's Comparative Literature Luncheon lecture. As you know, the series is sponsored by the Department of Comparative Literature with the support of the Center for Global Studies at Penn State as well. Before I turn the table to my colleague Marguerite, I want to mention that next week's luncheon lecture, this time in this place, will be Khalil Perez from the University of Pittsburgh, speaking on the topic Revolutionary Indians, Ramon Cementerio, the countries and the specters of 19th-century Caribbean patriotism. And that's next week, so please join us then. And I will now turn the table to Marguerite, who is the sponsor of today's lecture.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I will double down on the endorsement for Khalil Chow's talk next week. I've heard a version of it, and it's very good. But today I'm introducing Ms. Nicole Rizzuto, who teaches in the English department at Georgetown, where she specializes in British and Anglophone literatures, transnational modernism, and critical theory. She's published articles on a variety of topics, including the relationship between modernism and realism and the migration narratives of Jean Rhys and George Lamming. She has an article on Rebecca West's World War I novel, The Return of the Soldier, and a forthcoming article in Modernist Cultures titled Maritime Modernism, the Aqueous Form of Virginia Woolf's The Waves. I'm assuming I pronounced aqueous correctly.
Good enough.
Her book, Insurgent Testimonies, Witnessing Colonial Trauma in Modern and Anglophone Literature, was published by Fordham at the end of 2015. And by way of more substantive introduction, I first encountered Nicole's work at a conference on global modernisms a few years ago, at which she offered a sort of necessarily skeptical and critical perspective on the temptations of sliding too easily into a facile, and that's my word and not hers, globalism, in which all texts become too quickly interchangeably modernist, worldly, or global. I really liked this, and it was a very well-given argument that sort of reorganized the conversation at the conference very well. And I like this in particular because Nicole's own work reads against the grain of our investment in notions of rupture and the break as a principal way for consolidating periods and organizing literary history and history more broadly. So her critical investment is not in schema and in maintaining the sort of discretions of schema, but rather in thinking carefully about how we transgress those schema and establish bases for comparison and comparability. And to this end, the connections that she makes in her new book, Insurgent Testimonies, is that the connections she establishes amongst the works in Insurgent Testimonies is that they're connected not just by their shared experience of coloniality or something like the colonial context zone, but by what she calls the formal enactment of testimony. So she writes, just to quote a little bit from the book, that testimony in fiction and nonfiction, written during particular moments of imperial decline, codes earlier scenes of colonial conflicts is something like what Benjamin calls dialectical images. That is, passive oppression that issue forth in a moment of danger, and these literary works do not recover such pasts. Save through testimony, these pasts resist the apprehension of homogeneous time that guides historicists' projects of recovery. With that intro, what Nicole will be presenting today is from the third chapter of the book.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much, Mowgli. Can you all hear me? Am I speaking loudly enough into this microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I want to first thank Mowgli and Jonathan Eburn and the Department of Comparative Literature and the Center for Global Studies for inviting me here today. And thank you all for coming out to hear this talk. So as Mowgli mentioned, my talk today draws from one chapter of my book, Insurgent Testimonies, recently published. So you can think of this as a teaser, if you will. The chapter is quite long, and I analyzed several different works in depth there. Here, I'm going to sketch out just one of the central arguments, which has to do with emergency and temporality in Jamaican literature. I want to mention that the chapter is also framed within critical discussions about relationships among world literature, national and regional literatures, something I'll not really discuss at length here today, but I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested. The last decade has witnessed ongoing debates about how emergency law should or can be used to respond to insurgency and testimony. At stake in defining what justifies the implementation and extension of emergency is often the protection of states and legal systems against charges of illegitimate violence. Colonial novels of Jamaica demonstrate that these debates and stakes have a textured history and literary history. In the third chapter of my book, entitled Vindicating the Law, I consider two forgotten authors' works that span the period of anti-colonial nationalism in Jamaica. Herbert George de Lisser's 1919 historical romance, Revenge, A Tale of Old Jamaica, Victor Stafford Reid's 1949 epic novel, New Day, and finally, Reid's 1960 young adult novel, 65, published 2 years before Jamaican independence. I argue that these out-of-print works that have not triumphed in what Pascal Casanova calls the world republic of letters and are not part of the central canons of post-colonial or Anglophone literature today are nonetheless worth revisiting because all three are organized around the Morant Bay Rebellion. This event in imperial modernity produced debates about emergency, law, and violence that extend well into the 20th century and beyond, yet it is still overlooked in literary criticism. The details of the rebellion are by now well established. On October 16, 1865, several hundred Jamaican men and women, mostly black, entered the town of Morant Bay. They were led by Paul Bogle, a native Baptist minister. Bogle made clear that he was not demanding independence from colonial rule or rebelling against the Queen, to whom he even appealed to help Jamaicans resist inequities and injustices produced by the colonial government. The rebels targeted the Morant Bay courthouse and the vestry. They were protesting unfair wages, decisions regarding land redistribution, and among their grievances also listed the expulsion from the vestry of another of their leaders, the minister and politician George William Gordon. At Morant Bay, 18 officials and members of the militia were killed, and 31 were wounded, and 7 members of the crowd died. The rebellion then spread throughout the parish of St. Thomas in the east. At its peak, as historian Thomas Holt relates, the rebellion involved an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 people, men and women, African and Creole, estate workers, and settlers. In response to the uprising, Governor Edward Eyre declared martial law, which lasted for a month, and Jamaica was placed under Crown Colony rule, which lasted until 1944. The counter-insurgency under Eyre was of a length and violence such that it gave rise to an enormous controversy in England, which set conservative Victorians, such as Thomas Carlyle, against liberals, such as John Stuart Mill, organized as the Jamaica Committee. I argue that de Lisser's Revenge, as well as Reid's New Day, and to a lesser extent, 65, can be read as literary efforts to vindicate the law that was alleged to have been besmirched and violated under the emergency. On July 7th, 1866, the Jamaica Committee made a case for trying Governor Eyre before a court of law in England. The committee framed its argument in terms of vindication. The word vindicate appears numerous times in this brief appeal. To be vindicated, however, are not the Jamaicans who suffered various forms of torture and killing under Eyre's authority. To be vindicated is the law itself. The committee's goal, quote, is to vindicate by an appeal to judicial authority the great legal and constitutional principles which have been violated in the late proceedings and deserted by the government, unquote. What's been deserted and abandoned by law are not those who suffer its violence, but law itself. Law is outside of itself because English law is discontinuous with violence, which has been inflicted in its name, according to Mill and the committee. Neither de Lisser nor Reid would comfortably identify with the philosophies of Mill or the Jamaica Committee, and they certainly would not identify with each other's position on colonial rule. De Lisser was a brown Jamaican of Portuguese, Jewish, and African ancestry, and author of numerous historical romances covering events spanning the Spanish conquest of Jamaica in 1492 to the labor riots of 1938. Transforming from a supporter of the middle classes to a strong supporter of the white business elite, he opposed struggles for economic and social justice by brown and black working classes and was a staunch anti-nationalist. In contrast, Reid was a cultural nationalist dedicated to fomenting a multiracial and multicultural independent Jamaica. Nevertheless, I contend that both writers' novelistic depictions of the Morant Bay Rebellion attempt to vindicate English law. However, they do so not primarily thematically or through their plotting, but rather in their formal stagings of time. Revenge's orchestration of temporality attacks liberal principles at the foundation of the Jamaica Committee's criticism of the counter-insurgency based on a definition of necessity. New Day, which Reid composes as a rebuttal to the racist portrayal of Jamaican history he ascribes to de Lisser's historical romance, vindicates law through the performance of a Bildung narrative and a dialectical history of liberation that situates legal education as a panacea to violence enacted by reputedly politically unconscious insurgents. Despite their authors' antithetical positions on colonial rule then, both novels' temporal strategies attempt to vindicate English law by separating it from violence. However, I maintain, in both works, the formal production of witnessing generates unintended effects that create a friction with these strategies of vindication. This point is something that I can only touch upon here, but it's something I dedicate much attention to in the chapter. Today, I'll sketch how revenge engages legal discussions about emergency, temporality, and necessity that occurred in the wake of the rebellion. I'll then turn to consider how New Day mobilizes other structures of temporality to decouple English law from violence. Part 1, Revenge and the Temporality of Necessity. The Morant Bay Rebellion caused a dilemma in British law that the Governor-Eyre controversy laid bare: how to define the concept of necessity so as to judge whether state-organized violence was legitimate during a specific span of time in a so-called exceptional case, emergency. The legal scholar Nasser Hussain explains that, quote, emergency is an elastic category, stretching over political disturbances such as riots, the situation of sovereign war, and even constitutional crises within the sphere of the state, unquote, and argues that much political theory and constitutional jurisprudence mistakenly treat it as an external third term between sovereignty and law. History shows, however, that emergency is not external or exceptional, he writes, but forms, quote, a constitutive relation between modern law and sovereignty, unquote. During the Governor-Eyre controversy, this constitutive relation was alternately concealed and revealed in the juridical arguments centering on the category of necessity, which in legal terms is a temporal condition. The rebellion and counterinsurgency raised this problem: what is the temporality of necessity that underpins the implementation and extension of emergency? To justify the use of martial law in England, there must be evidence of necessity, that is, pressing danger, imminent threat to the security of the state. Based on the testimonies gathered by extensive inquiry into events by the Jamaica Royal Commission, Governor-Eyre had extended martial law well after that danger had expired in Jamaica. What constitutes a correct cognition of necessity, however, was the key point of contention between jurists in the aftermath of the counterinsurgency. Chief Justice Sir Alexander Cockburn and jurist William Francis Finlayson clashed over this definition. Cockburn maintained that imminent threat collapsed immediately after the troops arrived in Jamaica. Under English common law, acts committed during the month-long emergency were illegal violence, therefore. Finlayson disputes Cockburn's arguments by citing racial difference as the grounds for another definition of necessity that he asserts must be applied in the colonies. This concept of necessity pivoted on an alternative cognition of time. It replaced imminent threat with deterrence as its guiding principle. As justification, Finlayson claimed, first, that English common law in the colonies pertained only to white descendants, not those of Africa, so the definition of necessity must be adjusted accordingly here. Second, he claimed the situation during the Morant Bay Rebellion was that Jamaica was poised to become, he claimed, another Haiti during the Revolution, a scene of genocide. Necessity did not collapse with the arrival of the troops, he maintained, because black subjects greatly outnumbered white subjects, because the former were of a different species from the latter, and because they had been planning to kill the entire white population. As opposed to that based in imminent threat, the definition of necessity based in deterrence thus demands a dilated temporal view that travels backward to events in the distant past, in this case, the Haitian Revolution, and then forward to project what will happen in the future. Violence committed by the counterinsurgents during the entire length of the emergency in Jamaica was legal, and English common law protected from charges of illegitimate violence under this definition of necessity. Now, just to remind you, the Morant Bay Rebellion was not an attempt at secession from the empire, and nor was there a plan or a future plan to eradicate the entire white population, but these were some of the arguments circulating at the time. The contested definition of necessity was also central to the debates between two intellectuals involved in the governor-heir controversy, Thomas Carlyle and John Stuart Mill. In the chapter, I analyze these writers' arguments as well as those of Carlyle's disciple, James Anthony Froude, whose 1888 travelogue, The English in the West Indies, or The Bow of Ulysses, acts as a mediator, I contend, between the earlier Victorians' discussions and de Lisser's 1919 version of events in Revenge. The key argument Finlayson, Carlyle, and Froude share is that a correct cognition of necessity requires a dilated temporal perspective rather than a presentist one. There are numerous ways in which Revenge rehearses this temporality of necessity, and these nearly always relate to acts of deciphering and reading nature and landscapes. The book figures heir as a good reader, one who possesses a dilated perception and counterposes him to the naive protagonist Dick Carleton, a member of the white plantocracy whose sympathy with the black estate workers codes him as a liberal character and whose presentist perception prevents him from reading events as signs of future catastrophe by making reference back to the past. The novel relies upon an understanding of nature and landscape as sign systems from the very first page to make its argument for deterrence and to criticize, through dramatic irony, those who do not know how to read nature as signs. The book opens with a question of how to interpret what's described as a sign, fires on the horizon. Dick Carleton's mother interprets these as, quote, signs and signals, unquote, sent between black Jamaicans to commit genocide. That, quote, we, the white plantocracy, are wickedness to be purged out of the land, unquote. By rejecting their semiotic power and assuring the fire's semiotic power and assuring his mother, an English fiancé, that, quote, the danger is purely imaginary, unquote, Carleton strengthens de Lisser's argument for necessity based on deterrence. Carleton's practice of misreading is proven in the book's central chapter entitled A Sign from Heaven. So I mentioned in the introduction that my chapter analyzes how the novel's attempts to make arguments for a specific temporality of necessity produce narrative contradictions. Briefly stated here, in its confirmation of a certain semiotics of nature and landscape and endorsement of particular ways of reading these to make the claim for deterrence, Revenge must rely upon an epistemological system that it needs to delegitimize in order to legitimate Heir's Counter-Insurgency. That system is an Afro-Creole religion, Mayal, which the novel misidentifies as Obeah. The Sign from Heaven chapter relies upon Mayal in order to look through the lenses of Morant Bay's past and future and thereby present the rebellion as a genocidal secessionist movement and make the case for necessity as deterrence. The Sign from Heaven, centering on a ritual of catching the Mayal spirit, enacts the disappearance of whiteness under blackness, a key image condensing both the Haitian Revolution in the past as well as the economic and social conditions of population movements during the novel's composition in 1919. In this account of the rebellion's conception, a black woman, the, quote, chief hierophant, reads the night sky during the ritual over which Paul Bogle, the rebellion's leader, presides, with Carleton's English fiancée, Joyce, witnessing. The chapter relates that nature is a sign system that provides knowledge about future events once one catches the spirit. Still the stream of meaningless sounds poured out of the woman's foaming mouth, and still she whirled round the circle. Then the peninsular-like cloud which had been threatening the moon detached itself from the parent mass and drifted toward the now dimmed, half-enshrouded orb. The woman stood stock still and darted one arm toward it. A sign, she screamed, the answer of the spirit. The answer is coming, thundered Paul Bogle. We know tonight whether black or white will win. We will know tonight whether black or white will win. Steadily the cloud moved forward, and after it came creeping the dense black mass that now covered half the sky. At this moment the moon struggled out from beneath the veils of vapor that had dimmed it. Serenely it shone, as though conscious of its own triumph. A groan burst from Paul Bogle and was echoed by hundreds of the expectant crowd. but still they stared, and inch by inch, the darkness drew toward the light. Joyce, too, infected by the spirit of the people, watched the scene with intensest interest. At last, the cloud touched the edge of the moon, a moment after it had swept over most of it. Darker and darker grew the night, swiftly the light departed. Soon it was all gone. Now there arose a wild cry of triumph, and high above it rang the voice of Paul Bogle, "A sign, the Spirit give us a sign." In a mise en abîme of infection here, the Hierophant and Bogle catch the Mayal spirit, which allows them to read the sky as a prophecy that the Morant Bay Rebellion will repeat the structure of insurgency in Haiti, a colony attempting to detach itself from a parent mass or empire. Joyce, infected by the spirit of the people, can read the sky as Bogle and the Hierophant do, and then warn fiancé Carlton of the necessity of deterring future events. But the scene also generates a contradiction whose disruptive effects ripple throughout the entire text. This scene expresses that nature is and is not readable as sign. The contradiction is the consequence of spatial and temporal telescoping. The problem de Lisser confronts in his effort to vindicate law is this: nature must be a sign system, as the rebels and Joyce's reading of the sky imply, because then, according to narrative logic, a counterinsurgency based on the necessity of deterrence can be justified. But nature cannot be a sign system, because if it is, Mayal's interpretive methods do not reflect atavistic superstition, as Finlayson, Eyre, and Carlyle insisted at length, but rather constitutes a powerful epistemology that allows us to understand politico-economic forces of modernity. From the perspective of Jamaica in late October 1865, Bogle's interpretation of movements of darkness and light in the sky is based on superstition, because what he names a sign is not in fact a sign. It does not correctly designate who will be victor and vanquished at Morant Bay. The novel indicates, however, that we must also look from the perspective of those who witnessed the Haitian Revolution, and from this angle, it is a sign. It's the sign of intent of secession and genocide. In this way, the scene justifies Eyre's and Finlayson's cognition of the temporality of necessity. But there's another angle of vision in play here that contradicts these first two statements on the status of the sign. The passage restates Froude's argument in 1888 and uses its rhetoric and imagery. The removal of whites by black subjects from colonial spaces is on the verge of materializing once again, Froude warns. This time, it portends the loss of British economic power in the world. He writes that changes in the natural world are anagogical to and reflect population shifts during the end of the 19th century, which are also moral, political, and economic shifts. Quote, lands once under high cultivation are lapsing into jungle. The white is relatively disappearing, the black is growing. The West India Islands, once the pride of our empire, are passing out of our hands as its inhabitants are, quote, growing strong and more conscious of the changing order of things, unquote. The sign Joyce and the Jamaicans gaze upon is therefore also a warning addressed to readers outside and inside Jamaica in 1919. Anti-colonial nationalism in the 20th century is increasingly indicating that, quote, black is triumphing over, quote, white, unquote. But because the novel endorses the methods of witnessing and assumptions about the semiotic potential of nature, it attributes to a superstitious insurgency to make this very point. Revenge reveals that it cannot vindicate law and separate it from charges of violence without breaking from its own value system. A different sort of narrative contradiction attends Reid's New Day, published 30 years after Revenge. So I'll close with a reading of that text. Okay, part 2, Taking Time and Leaping Ahead, New Day. If de Lisser addresses the rebellion to bulwark dominant forces under attack at least since 1865, Reid addresses the rebellion to support the working classes and struggle toward Jamaican independence. New Day is the first Anglophone Caribbean novel written entirely in a Creole vernacular. Reid described New Day as a corrective to the racism of de Lisser's portrayals of Jamaican history. But by formally arguing for a specific cognition of temporality, it too vindicates English law and depicts the insurgency as the violent expression of politically unconscious subjects. Where de Lisser redefines the temporality of necessity to stall anti-colonial nationalism, Reid advocates for the necessity of a certain temporality as the condition for achieving an authentic national independence. The refrain that organizes New Day is, quote, "take time," unquote. Wait for conditions to be favorable to make claims for political independence. The novel maintains that English legal education teaches how to develop a cognition of time that will enable Jamaica to flourish and compete in a global economy with England, under whose protection the novel asserts it should remain, though not as a crown colony, but as an entity with, quote, "full representative government within the British Empire," unquote. That New Day expresses this tutelary cognition of time seems oddly anachronistic, considering that the novel is composed when anti-colonial agendas were articulated through a rhetoric of urgency in the Caribbean and abroad. This ideology of temporality is all the more striking because it occurs in what otherwise appears an exemplary work of its moment. Published 5 years after the lifting of Crown Colony rule, New Day emerges out of 1930s and 40s cultural nationalism. Literature of this period used the conventions of realism and portrayed local landscape, labor, and social practices of peasantry and working classes to interrupt colonial imaginaries and forge national consciousnesses. New Day features all of these elements. It depicts 80 years of post-emancipation struggle, beginning with the Morant Bay Rebellion and concluding with the end of Crown Colony rule. Where the novel breaks from other works of its era is in its usage of the European model of development, that of Bildung, to confront what it criticizes as premature attempts at national independence. In a linear, developmental fashion, the novel's third and final section relates the effects of protagonist Garth Campbell's education in England on the movement of Jamaica toward independence. Garth's personal development, or Bildung, models an ideal national Bildung, which, as uninterrupted, rational, and nonviolent, does not reflect the actual history of Jamaica. Because English law makes possible Garth's development, it will make possible Jamaica's development towards self-rule, the novel claims. This means that English law will redeem the Morant Bay Rebellion's violence, or what it depicts as the Morant Bay Rebellion as a violent sacrifice. English legal education provides the lesson the novel imparts: to take time, a point it belabors by issuing the warning in multiple, seemingly unconnected contexts. The loss of self-representation through Crown Colony rule, the result of the rebellion, is deemed necessary because Jamaicans did not know not to leap ahead. Like Revenge, New Day misrepresents the rebellion as secession from England. A bloodthirsty Bogle demands secession, total freedom, unquote. This supposed demand for immediate sovereignty only proved that Jamaicans required more tutoring. A hasty secession from the empire would only have resulted in the incapacity to manage the world system. A nation that cannot suture itself into that system, Garth Campbell and the novel assure us, is a nation that is not truly, quote, independent, mature, and free, unquote. Garth Campbell's legal education in England enables him to help Jamaica manage pressure of multinationals like United Fruit and Wisco, effectively deal with the rise of trade unions, and forecast and exploit the changing role of the sugar industry in the global economy during World War II. Garth understands Jamaica as part of a world that's necessarily one and stitched together into a system of economic dependency. He's able to acquit himself and hundreds of workers in a trial following a trade union meeting that turns violent. He can do this because, our narrator regularly reminds us, he learned to, quote, talk strong but with reason before the king's bench, unquote. Quote, this boy, whom many learned men had taught how to speak before the king's bench, unquote, also resolves disputes between management and labor and secures a thriving economy on the Campbell estate and in the parish, which becomes a utopic parallel colony in miniature, a foreign body enveloped in an actual colony plagued with poverty and violent labor disputes at the time. by establishing conditions of rational discussion and consensus among the plantocracy, Garth prevents a violent uprising by estate workers, which the novel identifies as potentially another Morant Bay rebellion. New Day also draws a connection between political independence and business acumen by stating that both require a correct cognition of time. Garth preaches, quote, "In doing business, you know there is one cardinal rule, never act in haste," unquote. When Crown Colony rule is finally lifted as a consequence of Garth's mediation between the colony and his legal connections in England, to whom he petitions, the novel's narrator, Garth's great-uncle John Campbell, declares that the violent sacrifices of the Morant Bay Rebellion have been redeemed. His comments assert that Garth's Bildung parallels that of Jamaica. Redemption happens as the result of an organic process of personal and national development, the ripening of a seed. Quote, "I, what a fruit our seed has borne. I am glad that Naomi and me sent Garth, Davy's offspring, to learn of the law in England," unquote. Jamaica has finally, quote, "reached our age of reason because now men can march with the banner of the law waving over them instead of shells talking of blood and fire," unquote. These organicist metaphors of growth are repeated in Garth's comments about, quote, "the colonial empire," unquote. "We are growing up. We are getting out of the chrysalis." And the whole passage is up there. I'm not going to dwell on it for now because I want to move through. But however, like Revenge, New Day also contains an ongoing interruption of its stated arguments about temporality and law. Its formal commitments to the protocols of what I contend is a modern epic shows that it has difficulty rejecting the unequivocal demand for immediate sovereignty without equivocation. In tension with the smooth plotting of the Bildung narrative and its valuation of temporal continuity and growth are constant temporal disruptions that organize the entire text. Practicing the techniques of what Franco Moretti calls a modern epic, New Day configures the relation between past, present, and future in ways that undercut the linear trajectory of the Bildung narrative that configures law as separate from and a cure to the leaping ahead that it determines as a form of illegitimate anti-colonial violence. By rehearsing the epic form, that is, the text incessantly presses against the ideology of tutelage and legal education it espouses because it refuses structurally to, quote, "take time." In refusing to obey this organizing refrain, New Day also challenges oppositions between world text and national saga. And this is really too long for me to get into here, but I'm happy to talk about it more afterwards. For the sake of time, I'll close by briefly describing what I mean by the text leaping ahead and what I mean by modern epic. In his study of the modern epic, Franco Moretti cites Vargas Llosa to describe the temporal structure of Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. This book's management of time, an interplay of prolepses and analepses that has the narrative traveling repeatedly in each episode from the future to the past and then back to the future, is what gives the work its, quote, "epic grandeur," unquote. Here's Llosa on the basic cell of Marquez's text. At the start of an episode, the main fact in a narrative unit is mentioned. It is usually the last in chronological terms. In other words, the episode begins with a leap toward the future. The narrative then jumps to the remotest past of the fact mentioned, whence it follows a linear chronological account of events, until it reaches the future fact that has been displaced and reported at the start of that episode. In this way, the circle is closed and the episode ends where it began, just as it had begun where it would end. This nearly describes the structure of narrative time in New Day, but with a crucial difference. The circle is never closed in New Day. This is because, I contend, what organizes the proleptic and analeptic structure and creates its temporal motion is something different from that in Marquez's work. In New Day, this is the syntactical structure of its vernacular. The novel's temporality rehearses the rhythm of its linguistic code. This code is the crystallization of national as well as transnational forces and histories, and is also irreducible to them. The novel's other refrain, beside take time, is remember, I remember, which occurs in every episode. This refrain rehearses in miniature the almost circular temporal motion of the narrative that occurs in each of the novel's episodes. Is remember is a comment delivered in each episode by the narrator from a point in the future. Its utterance signifies that the narrative has leapt forward, jumped over a time that the text will then proceed to recount in the episode that follows, so as to try to catch up with the point from which this account begins. Rather than progress immediately into its account of the past that has been leapt over, however, the text first turns backward as the narrator repeats the phrase, yet with a difference, I remember. Just as the phrase begins with two words and travels backwards, repeating the words with a difference, is remember, I remember, so too does the novel as a whole follow this structure. Every episode moves from a future to a past that's been left over, and then, instead of bringing us back to the exact moment from which the episode's narration began, it leaps ahead past events leading up to that moment and landing on a future moment from which the utterance, is remember, I remember, will be issued. The leap forward at the end of each episode spurs the cycle to begin again in the next episode. The narrative, quote, circle is never closed, therefore, and the text is something, I think that the structure of temporality is more like a spiral. There's always a disjuncture, a leap forward, a refusal to take time that leaves each episode open. Okay, so because of time, I'm going to stop here and close by saying that this not quite circular structure, modeled on the novel's linguistic code, both breaks with its attempts to vindicate English law as the basis for achieving national independence, without, however, turning New Day into a national saga or a pre-modern epic. This is something that Moretti talks about. It would seem, not in terms of New Day though, it would seem all the more of a national work or national saga if its epic temporality is modeled on the Creole vernacular it uses, what has been called nation language. However, in its refusal to take time, it is actually modeled on a language that is not one, not unified or national. In fact, this so-called vernacular is spoken by no one anywhere. Reid acts as an inventor, or rather a bricoleur, to create this language out of basilex, acrolex, and mesolex, spoken in Jamaica, as well as Elizabethan English and Welsh. In its refusal to take time, New Day becomes a world text that is also excessive or exorbitant to the world, the actual world, and one that critiques a vindication of English law and the cultural and literary forms that express it. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that rich and powerful talk. I'm going to try to ask a question in anticipation of others. And I can't help but think a little bit about why some of this sort of books like The Rising Tide of Color and these other sort of, horrible fabulations about a kind of the dilated temporal you became so instrumental for people like Marcus Garvey, right? So I mean, if I'm going to get this right, hopefully, if what you're talking about is not so much a question of jurisprudence, but of causation, right? These are two kind of racialized epistemic formalizations of cause. One, a kind of categorical, static idea of necessity based on imminent threat, and the other being a kind of progressive, teleological, world spirit, evolutionary moment. If that's being legitimated, or if that latter one is being legitimated by projecting it onto indigenous and Creole belief systems, which are often considered to be timeless and self-reproducing, right? In order for it to work, legalistically, it has to sort of work for everybody, right? They're going to attack white people, right? They are going to attack the so-called us. Then their systems are not timeless, but actually in time.
the idea of that being recast as sort of eschatological time as opposed to an emergency time, right? It gets you like someone like Marcus Garvey, who has his own version of the new day. What I'm curious about hearing more about is your final idea of a kind of vernacular futurity, as opposed to simply, a co-optation of that for different political ends, co-optation of the romantic idealist version of temporal unfolding for the sake of anti-colonial politics. If there's something else in this vernacular, I mean, to what extent is that not a sort of return to Enlightenment type ideas about temporality, with the break that sort of the self-reproducing versions of Enlightenment that people talk about when they talk about the Marquis de Sade or revolutionary time, right? I mean, is it sort of, can you kind of articulate a little bit about what's the through line in terms of this epistemological current in your own work, and what you seem to be advocating as sort of, a kind of model for a certain kind of political formation in terms of causation? Could you say a bit more about this vernacular idea?
Okay, so let me talk about three elements that you brought up, and let me see if I can kind of separate these and discuss how I think they're working in the case of the Morant Bay Rebellion, in the question of necessity, and how that relates to both the use of Afro-Creole religions and as an epistemology in Revenge, and then also the vernacular in New Day. So the first thing I want to say is, it's interesting that you were like, oh, okay, so this idea of a dilated temporal perspective is one that has to do with, a teleological notion of time, a kind of broader notion of time, a world historical notion of time. For the jurists who were debating the Counter-Insurgency, this idea of a teleology, or a kind of that need not necessarily be in play explicitly, except insofar as by claiming that indigenous people are destined to behave in a certain way, this can guarantee us that we have a logical basis in order to make a claim to change the way that English common law is actually going to be used in the colony. We know that if people rise up and they are of a certain color, then they are going to do it over and over again. That's the logic, right? So it's like, if there was a Haiti, there's going to be a Morant Bay Rebellion that repeats Haiti, right? So it's an implicit idea that these events will repeat themselves because of a quite explicit claim that there's not only racial difference, but species difference, right, between white English people and indigenous people in, and also like migrants in Jamaica at the time, like workers, laborers, everything, right? So this is all, that's all part of the logic of like why necessity must be deterrence and why it can't be imminent threat, right?
Right.
So then,
like in Dracula, right? Sort of, like right, same racial logic as you see in Dracula, right? Dracula will always attack. He may have longer than humans, but if you don't snuff it out now, it'll always come.
yes, and this also connects up to something that has to do with the issue of Afro-Creole religion and temporality and their histories. So one of the things I talk about at length in the chapter is actually the way that Revenge completely or dehistoricizes and then rearranges Obeah, Voodoo, and Mayal. Okay, so I look at these different histories and different commentators on how these functioned at different times in different places. Now, what de Lisser wants to do is he wants to use this idea of catching the Mayal spirit. He wants to use this practice, this ritual of catalepsy that's associated with Mayal. However, he's historically incorrect here, because these practices don't actually happen until after the 1860s, after the Morant Bay Rebellion takes place. So the first thing that he's doing is he's looking backwards, he's using his presentist perception and then imposing this back on the Morant Bay Rebellion. This is not how they operated. But he also is collapsing the use of voodoo and other rituals in Haiti around the revolutionary period and imputing them to, giving them a role that they did not actually play during the Morant Bay Rebellion. Why does he want to do this? He wants to do this so that he can, first of all, highlight needing to have a kind of understanding of history as repetitive, as dilated, as like they're always going to do the same things over and over again, right? But this is also his kind of use and misreading of Mayal and voodoo, and is also related to how, at the moment that he was writing this text, Obeah was functioning and being policed in Jamaica at the time. What was happening with Obeah at the time in the Caribbean, and specifically in Jamaica, was that it was undergoing new forms of policing, because in the beginning of the 20th century, it was functioning in a way that it did not during the Morant Bay Rebellion. It was becoming a kind of rallying cry or a cultural practice that allowed people to come together, right? So as I talk about in the chapter, during the Morant Bay Rebellion, there were these creations of important black publics around Moravian Baptist collectivities, right? And these publics helped to kind of, I don't want to say agitate, but let's say organize to demand for changes in land redistribution and for unfair wages. They created their own legal systems. But these things, none of these functioned the way that revenge has them function. So this is all to say that you're absolutely right. He needs to collapse all of the historical differences between all of these different Afro-Creole practices in order to make a claim about dilation. Now, can I talk about the last one quickly, the vernacular? Okay, so this is what I want to say about the vernacular. In terms of the idea of the vernacular, just to contextualize, so New Day is considered a thoroughly national text, right? And why is it a national text? In part because it's written in this vernacular, this so-called nation language, right? But it is not. So what Reid does is, at the end of the book, he gives a glossary of terms. It seems to decode everything. Then you kind of push further into the research, and you find out through interviews that are very difficult to track down that, in fact, this was not the case. The case was this. Publishers were demanding, they really wanted a taste of authenticity, right? So at the time they were like, okay, write something in your nation language, that's fine. But we also have to be able to sell this book outside, right? So what we have here is a kind of marketplace being determined in the US and England, asking Reid to both give the mark of authenticity, but also make it a kind of lingua franca, right? So what he decided to do, he says, is to take what he thinks are the most beautiful parts of his own language, or Caribbean languages generally, poeticity. And so he focuses on that idea of is remember, I remember, because he loves repetition. He says repetition and the kind of pacing and rhythms of the language are what really give it its stamp of difference and what makes it beautiful. So then he goes back, takes Elizabethan English, looks at Basilex and Acrolex, different kind of stratifications of linguistic practice in Jamaica, and blends these together. Now, this is something that I didn't say, but I do mention in the chapter as well. One of the things that's problematic, I think, about the futurity that New Day imagines, even despite the fact that I'm saying that it interrupts its kind of linear trajectory and it's sort of like dialectical liberation narrative, it's like it's all going to work out, we just need the law. Here's the problem, or I don't want to say it's a problem, but I'll just leave this for others to decide. When you look at how early readers in the US and Britain responded to New Day, one of the things they often mentioned was that they were really taxed to understand what was going on because they had to, quote, readjust their linguistic expectations. So the text was really kind of resisting their ability to kind of just jump right in and get the native informants to say the story of what was really going on, right? In that sense, I think the novel is very interesting, right? You have to do some work. So what Reid is doing is kind of forging, you could say, in the best sense, a kind of transnational communicative or interlocutory structure that's also subnational, right? He's making the dominant do a little bit more work and trying to kind of get them to engage. Here's the deal. The very beginning of the text is all vernacular. The middle of the text, kind of. The end of the text, the proportion has changed radically. And what we find is much more, quote, standard British and American English, and much fewer instances of this kind of bricolage vernacular. It's hard for me to think, and maybe this is not a good reading, it's hard for me not to take the kind of developmental story of Garth freeing us from Crown Colony rule by going to England and learning law. It's hard for me not to separate that from the kind of rise of a standardized English and the kind of decline of the vernacular at the end of the book. This is all to say, I don't know what kind of futurity the text imagines, or when it imagines a futurity, I think it's a highly, I would put it in the terms of like conscript of modernity problem. And I'm gonna stop talking because I've been like yakking forever, but I can talk more about that. Sorry, thank you.
So I still have 3 questions, but I'll try to make it quick. So I'm wondering, I mean, understanding completely that the religions are messed up, like I get that part. But I'm wondering if what's at work in the kinds of contradictions that you're talking about is not a linguistic component of Mayal time. See where I'm going?
No.
Okay. So if we take Mayal in the way that Erna Broadbent discusses it in her novel of that name, right? Then you have a simultaneity of times in which the futurity revolution can never wind out or never evolve out of Mayal time because it's not linear time.
Oh, that's interesting.
See what I'm getting at?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so that's number 1.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2 is to what degree one has to really take into account the fact that even Reid knew that at an economic level, the Haitian Revolution was a total failure, right? So what I'd like to see is some more textuality about the fact that, you know, Haiti only finished paying off the imposed fines in the international world in the 1940s, right, for having won the revolution. It's the only time in the history of humankind where you win the war and you have to pay a head price on all the slaves that you freed. So, to me, that economy, since you were talking about economy as separating out from nationalism, that would give a huge amount of sort of dimensionality, which may well be in the chapter which I haven't read. So, okay, so that's the second thing. And then the third thing I'm thinking about is what happens to that notion of revolutionary time in the inheritors of Vic Reid and Company, which would be Michelle Cliff's No Telephone to Heaven.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
Okay, so those are my questions.
Okay, so first of all, I'm super interested in what you just said about the structure of Mayal time and simultaneity, and I hadn't thought about it, and part of the reason why is this. But I could have, and I could, is because Mayal doesn't play a part at all in New Day, it only appears in Revenge, right?
And it appears as messy, like it appears in a bizarre way. But I'm just wondering, yeah, you see what I'm saying? I mean, it could still be appearing in Vic Reid's linguistic practices.
That's really interesting. And you know what? It had not even remotely occurred to me that that could be the case. And that's an extremely interesting idea. And I love it. And I want to investigate it more. It never occurred to me that that could be the case. The second thing about Haiti. So here's the other deal. The way that Haiti, let me put quote marks around it. Haiti operates as a placeholder in the chapter because the only things that I am actually taking on are, I don't want to use the word appropriation, but it's orchestration by these jurists, by Carlyle, by Mill, and then by Lisser and Reid. Haiti doesn't really play a part, or not explicitly, let's say, in New Day at all.
I know, but Reid has to be looking at it and going, what do you win if you win?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, no, well,
Financially.
I think, okay, so the way that I would answer that question is, the way that he kind of, that Reid maybe displaces, if displaces is even the correct word, or indirectly kind of engages that, is, I think the novel is very unsure. of what
Exactly,
he
so I
meant.
think it adds to your argument.
Yes, it definitely does. You're absolutely right. It's very unsure about it. I mean, that's why we have pages and pages and pages about economic depredations,
Exactly.
right? Exactly.
So I think that link is there.
That, yeah, and that's a really important point. So the Michelle Cliff thing, so I would say, I wanted to just say, this whole thing of narrative time in Caribbean literature is something I'm kind of obsessed with, and to the point where it's a problem now because I can't organize how I want to move forward in my next project. I have all these ideas. I want to talk about No Telephone to Heaven. I want to talk about Landings the Emigrants. I also want to talk about Carl Phillips' Final Passage,
Yeah.
right? Because there is this like circular spiralic structure in all of these, right? But I think in each one of them, it's doing different work. So I have an article on landing that I wrote years ago before I had even conceptualized the Nick Reid chapter, and so what I'm hoping to do is go back, and what I do in that article is to think about the way that time is being staged through these prolepsies and analepsies, specifically with perhaps Lamming's pedagogic view in mind of learning how to learn from error. So specifically the idea of mistakes. What we do in the Emigrants through the staging of time is like we keep realizing that we're making mistakes. Everybody thinks that one thing is another thing, but they're never really that thing. That's different from the circularity or the spiralic, let's say, temporality that's happening in No Telephone to Heaven and also in Final Passage. How so? I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, and also you could argue that No Telephone to Heaven explodes its own spirality. Anyway.
Okay, that's an explosive statement, but yeah, thank you for...
Yeah, if you think about the ending of it.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. This shouldn't surprise you because I told you I was going to ask you this last night. And it has to do with kind of what I perceive to be a kind of figuring absence in your approach to emergency law, which is the state of exception debates and conversations, which are these days very often the most common ways of approaching that question, and which so often do so through, if not in Schmidt and Agamben, then in their inheritors, in spatializations, little pockets of emergency or exception, the Pequod, Guantanamo, post-Katrina, New Orleans. And it seems to me, I wonder, I guess, what your relationship is to those forms of thought about what is, after all, the same object or a very similar object, which is emergency law, and whether you think temporality does something that spatiality doesn't do. And maybe there's no answer to this, but what I see you popping out on the other side is into a new forms of spatiality, your metaphors of circle and spiral, which are ways of talking about emergency law and space that make no reference to those ways of thinking about little pockets of exception.
That's a lot smarter than any way I could have put it in my book. I'll put it that way, because I have not made the connection, or I feel like I know what you're getting at, and if I am doing that, I'm happy about it, because I have to admit that, I'll just tell you, since if you read the book, you'll see it. The fourth chapter of the book does rely on like Agamben and Butler, states of exception, the idea of Guantanamo, like Butler with governmentality, the response to Agamben. And what I do in that book is I read Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book, A Grain of Wheat, and I talk very much about spatiality. I rely on the argument about spatiality. I talk about temporality in that book, but the coming together of those two, Matt, I have to tell you, the way you just put that to me, that's super interesting to me. Because I think I took my cues, definitely in my fourth chapter, I definitely took my cues from Agamben as much as I was like, oh, I don't want to rehash this thing over and over again. Whatever, you do what you do. So, and A Grain of Wheat lends itself to that kind of pocket thing because you're in camps, right? And there's about this sort of like doubling of these characters and stuff. But that's something that I'm gonna struggle to think about that more and to think about how like my own interest in temporality and questioning of this idea of exceptionality can also work in a kind of more like as a mode of thinking more comparatively about different kinds of questions where the law seems to be outside of itself. Like right now, my new project, I have 2 new projects going, but one of them is on pirates, I was saying. It's very unformulated, it's like weird obsession about pirates. But the history of piracy and pirate law is another one that seems to be a history of exception in these different ways that would ask me to think about time and space in new ways.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I follow up on Matt's question? I want to formulate it in a much less sophisticated way. But just to say, I wondered as you were talking with this kind of division between sort of spatial and temporal metaphors, whether nature was a primarily temporal or spatial sort of question for you, because it seems to be more the latter, and yet the spatial organization of landscape seems sort of inescapable, right?
Yeah, you want to hear something that's so funny that you asked that? Because when I was when I was writing the talk by drawing from, so it's like a 60-page chapter or something, so I had to cut everything. And when I was looking back at the arguments about nature and the semiotics of nature, I was like, the sky, the hurricane. Okay, so another thing that plays a big part in this text in terms of sign systems, it's not just fires, it's fires and hurricanes, right? So these events condense a kind of temporality and spatiality in them that I feel like I don't talk about that doubleness to them. I think that what I've done in the chapter is like, I take them as spatial objects that become the occasion for arguments about temporality. You know what I mean? So in other words, when they read the night sky, right? I don't think about the temporal orchestra. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about how things are moving at the same time. I tend to focus mostly on just the act itself, right? And so I kind of turn landscape, let's say, into a static form in the chapter. But I was totally thinking about this when I was reading. I was like, yeah, but these are themselves all temporal indexes, like hurricanes. And I'm actually going to write on this all these sea novels that have to do with like getting caught in the spiral of a hurricane and stuff. And that's why I think it's also occurred to me as a temporal kind of problem as well. I think the reason I reduce them to space here is because I have a tendency, as you can probably tell because I can't shut up, right, is to write such long chapters that I need to, or that was my reductionary mode, right? These were spatial objects that gave rise to like an argument about temporality.
Well, in the interest of making a segue from space back to time, we're out of it, so please jump in. Thank you, Nicole.